Okay, so let's dive into this stack of sources you've given us. It's quite a mix, isn't it?
It really is. We've got historical articles covering, well, a huge range: ancient law, personal stories, military stuff, even how the environment shaped empires.
And the idea here is that you've provided the raw material and we're going to unpack it together.
Exactly. Think of this as your custom deep dive. Our mission is to guide you through it, pull out the most important bits, the surprising connections, the things that are genuinely relevant.
Right. Giving you that shortcut to being well informed on these topics without you having to wade through everything yourself. We're looking for those key takeaways, the aha moments.
All drawn directly from the material you shared. So, yeah, let's get started. Where should we begin? How about way back?
Sounds good. Let's turn our attention first to some really ancient foundations. Mesopotamia.
Perfect. Let's look at life in ancient Babylon, specifically under King Hammurabi.
Okay, Hammurabi. That's around, what, 18th century BC?
That's right. He reigned from 1792 to 1750 BC, and Babylon was, a real powerhouse then. What's incredible is how much we know about their daily lives.
From the clay tablets, right? The cuneiform.
Exactly. That wedge-shaped writing. These texts give us such detailed glimpses. It's amazing, really.
Like what kind of details? I know the family was central.
Very central. We get descriptions of typical houses, usually built around an open courtyard. And wealthier homes might even have bathrooms or sort of early security systems, things you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Ah, and marriage.
Mostly monogamous, it seems. But the law code, Hammurabi's famous code, allowed for exceptions, like if a wife couldn't have children.
Okay.
And they sometimes had written marriage agreements called ricus due. These would detail things like the dowry, which was important. Divorce was also possible.
And there's that really specific story about divorce, isn't there? The cutting the hem.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. It's from an 18th century BC text. This guy, Ahamninershi, he really doesn't want to go through the marriage.
He says something pretty dramatic, right?
He does. Like, he wouldn't stay married even if they chopped him up. But the woman involved says she still loves him. In the end, though, the text describes him knotting up her hem and literally cutting it off. That was the symbolic act.
Wow. So very specific rituals. And children were obviously key.
Absolutely fundamental. The texts even mention things they tried for infertility herbs, amulets, maybe even magic arts.
And adoption was common too.
Very common, and for all sorts of practical reasons. You might adopt to get an heir, or to train an apprentice in your trade, or just to make sure someone would look after you in old age and perform your funeral rites.
So it wasn't just about family lineage.
No, it served economic and social functions too. Adoptees could inherit property or learn a skill. There's an example of a weaver adopting someone essentially as an apprentice.
And the economy itself. What do the sources tell us?
Well, sons often learn trades from their fathers. But it wasn't all state-controlled. Lots of people worked privately. Those clay tablets list all sorts of professions: gardeners, blacksmiths, bakers, builders.
A diverse economy, then.
Definitely. And textile production was huge, often involving women, children, and also enslaved people. They had established trade routes, moving goods across the region. That trade was vital.
And looming over all this is Hammurabi's code.
Right, the famous law code. 282 laws inscribed on stone pillars, covering everything: social structure, the economy, rules for women, punishments. It aimed to establish order.
How did their justice system actually work? Did they have lawyers?
No lawyers as we know them. The trials were pro se, meaning people represented themselves in court. They had respected judges, sometimes multiple judges hearing a case, probably for legitimacy.
So you argued your own case.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
There's even a record of King Hammurabi himself hearing a case about property ownership, a house in an orchard, and he set a fee for future lawsuits, likely to stop people bringing trivial complaints.
Interesting. But it wasn't all serious business, was it? Did they have fun?
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention entertainment. Music was popular, especially the flute. There was dance, professional entertainers, singers, snake charmers, acrobats, even bear handlers.
Bear handlers. Okay.
Yeah. And they played games, like dice games, using animal ankle bones. Sometimes these were even used for divination, for astrology.
And big festivals, too.
The Akitu festival, the New Year celebration, was really important. It honored the god Marduk and his victory over chaos, symbolized by Tiamat. It was a major event that brought society together.
Now, there's a sensitive topic the sources touch on: abortion. And it seems there were different views.
That's a really important point, and the sources show complexity. On one hand, we have a medical text that actually describes a method for inducing abortion using plants. It suggests it was known, maybe sometimes practiced.
But on the other hand,
Contrast that sharply with the Middle Assyrian laws, from a different time, maybe 14th century BC, these laws imposed an incredibly harsh punishment for a woman causing her own abortion. Impalement.
Wow, impalement.
Yeah. So you see very different approaches across different times and places within Mesopotamia. It highlights that social norms and laws weren't uniform, even on something like this.
What really strikes me from all this Babylonian material is just how much detail about everyday life, about their society, their laws, their beliefs, how much of it survived on those clay tablets.
It's truly amazing. It underscores the power of written records, doesn't it? Even fragmented ones, they bring a whole civilization back to life.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Moving west across the ancient world to the Mediterranean coast. Let's talk about the Phoenicians.
Ah, yes. The people history calls the Phoenicians. And the first big takeaway from the sources is, well, they probably didn't call themselves that at all.
Really? So what did they call themselves?
They likely identified much more with their specific city. Were you from Tyre or Sidon or Gabal, which the Greeks called Byblos? Each city was quite independent, with its own dialect, its own gods, its own policies.
So where did Phoenician come from then?
It's a Greek name. Shows up in Homer's poems, maybe 8th, 7th century BC. It means reddish purple.
The famous purple dye.
It's exactly. From the Murex sea snails. Incredibly valuable stuff they traded. So the name probably came from that trade good. Or maybe, some suggest, from their tanned skin from being sailors. But the dye seems more likely.
The sources also mention different ideas about where these people originally came from.
They do. You have the biblical tradition linking them to Canaan. Then Greek and Roman writers had theories about migrations, maybe from the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea area.
But archaeology tells a different story.
Yeah, this is key. Archaeology strongly contradicts those migration theories. The evidence points to deep, continuous roots right there in the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast, going back to at least the 3rd millennium BC.
So they were basically the descendants of the earlier Canaanites.
Pretty much, yes. There's a strong cultural continuity. Canaanite culture had its heyday in the 2nd millennium BC city-states, a West Semitic language related to Hebrew, trade links. They were even under Egyptian influence for a while. There's a great Egyptian text from the 13th century BC describing Tyre as richer in fishes than in sand.
And the cities themselves show this continuity.
Absolutely. Places like Jabal and Tyre were inhabited continuously by their ancestors. Their location was crucial too, usually on coastal promontories or islands, giving them good harbors and control of the land routes nearby.
Perfect for trade.
Essential for trade. We see evidence of trade with places like Ebla, way back around 2300 BC. By the late Bronze Age, say 1500 BC, cities like Jabal, Sidon, Tyre, and Ugarit were major hubs.
Then something major happened around 1200 BC, the Sea Peoples.
Right, a period of major crisis and upheaval across the Mediterranean, linked to groups known as the Sea Peoples. Many cities were destroyed, including some key trading rivals of the Phoenician cities, like Ugarit.
And the Phoenician cities survived.
They did, and here's a crucial insight. They didn't just survive, they thrived in the aftermath. With rivals like Ugarit gone and not rebuilt and the big Egyptian and Hittite empires declining, a power vacuum opened up. The Phoenician cities, with their maritime skills and established networks, were perfectly placed to step in and basically monopolize sea trade.
So their rise was partly because their competition disappeared.
Exactly. By the 10th century BC, Tyre had become the dominant power among them. Their legacy is huge. Of course, they played a key role in developing the alphabet, building on earlier Canaanite scripts. Their religion evolved from Canaanite roots, and they famously expanded westward, founding colonies like Carthage and Cadiz.
It's so interesting that their identity seems tied more to their individual cities and the sea, rather than a unified Phoenician nation.
Yes, the sources really emphasize that city-based maritime focus. That's who they were.
Okay, let's leap forward quite a bit now, centuries ahead, into the medieval world. We're shifting from ancient empires to something much more, well, personal, the origins of pharmacies, where we get medicines.
Ah, the birth of the drugstore. It's a fascinating story. You have to remember, medieval Europeans faced constant threats from disease, plagues. They were desperate for cures and relief.
And they looked to nature, mostly.
Primarily, yes. Plants were by far the most important source of remedies. But they also used other things, precious stones, believe it or not, like agate for eye problems or jasper for hemorrhoids, mineral waters too, and even animal or human products sometimes.
Where did the idea of a dedicated place to get these remedies start?
A key point here is that early pharmacies really began in monasteries. Monastic hospitals and abbeys often provided care for the sick.
And monks were well placed to do this.
They were. They had libraries, access to ancient medical texts like Dioscorides' De Materia Medica, a really important Greek work listing hundreds of medicinal plants and their uses. And crucially, they cultivated these plants in special medicinal gardens, the herbularias.
So the first pharmacies were literally rooms in monasteries.
Yes, basically. They set up distinct rooms or dispensaries. We have early references like from Camaldoli in Italy in the 11th century. A very famous example is Santa Maria Novella in Florence.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Right. It started as a 13th century Dominican convent pharmacy. The friars gained such a reputation for their remedies that they eventually opened it up to the public. It's a really significant precursor to the modern pharmacy.
And eventually the roles of doctor and pharmacist started to separate.
They did, particularly from the 13th century onwards. This often went hand in hand with the rise of physician guilds. The idea solidified. Physicians diagnose and prescribe, apothecaries prepare the medicines. Rulers like Emperor Frederick II in Sicily even put this into law around 1231.
So regulations started coming in?
Exactly. This is another key development. Apothecaries became subject to rules and oversight. In Paris, statutes from 1281 banned them from visiting the sick or giving out medicine without a prescription. Later guild statutes in Paris required apothecaries to be literate enough to read prescriptions, banned dangerous poisons, mandated labeling with the date, and urged fair pricing.
Interesting. Were women involved in this at all?
That's an important thread. Despite formal guilds often being male-dominated and sometimes hostile to women practicing medicine, women's traditional roles as caregivers meant they often had a lot of practical knowledge about remedies.
Like folk medicine.
Yes, and sometimes more than that. In 17th century England, it became quite fashionable for upper-class women to compile receipt books, essentially recipe books for medicines. Some women, like Hannah Woolley, even linked this knowledge to social advancement. And we know Quaker women colonists brought healing skills to America.
You mentioned Dioscorides' text earlier. That was foundational.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
listed hundreds of plants. For instance, it mentioned cyclamen being used for everything from headaches to skin issues, simpler things too, like cinnamon and anise for bad breath.
It sounds like these medieval pharmacies could be quite sophisticated places.
They really could. There's a description of a 15th century Italian fresco that shows a whole scene.
Mhm.
The pharmacist, a customer, someone grinding ingredients, maybe a monk in keeping accounts, shelves lined with jars and pots, even things like amulets and sponges hanging up. And incredibly, that Santa Maria Novella pharmacy in Florence, it's still operating today. It claims to be the oldest pharmacy in the world still in continuous use. We even have specific prescriptions from 15th century Spain for King Henry IV, listing ingredients like saffron, chamomile, roses, and their prices in maravedis.
What's really striking is how this everyday thing, the pharmacing, has these deep roots in religious institutions, evolving through professionalization and regulation over centuries.
It's a fascinating journey from monastic gardens to the corner drugstore, isn't it?
Definitely. Now, from the relative quiet of those early pharmacies, let's shift to something much stormier. The reign of one of England's most infamous kings.
Bad King John. His reputation certainly precedes him.
He's often painted as the ultimate villain, right?
Yeah.
Especially compared to his brother, Richard the Lionheart, the hero figure. And it's telling that no English king after him was named John.
It is. Although an important nuance from the sources is that contemporary chroniclers didn't necessarily see him as uniquely awful compared to other rulers of the time. It was later writers, particularly monks.
Ugh, the monks again.
Yes, they had serious grievances because of his conflicts with the church. They really amplified the negative portrayal, contributing hugely to what's called his Black Legend.
And why the nickname Lackland?
That came from his youth. As the youngest son of Henry II, the initial plan was that he wouldn't inherit significant lands. He was literally the son without land until his brother Richard later granted him territories.
He was part of that powerful Plantagenet dynasty.
Yes, they originated in Anjou, in France. The name comes from the Plantagenista, the broom plant, their emblem. They controlled this huge Angevin empire, England, plus vast territories in France inherited through Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. This also meant they were technically vassals of the French king for those French lands, which was a constant source of tension.
What was John like as a young man?
Well, he was the youngest, apparently his father's favorite initially. But he quickly got a reputation for being unreliable, impulsive, maybe a bit treacherous. The chronicler Gerald of Wales described him as easily led astray by irresponsible companions in his youth.
And loyalty wasn't his strong suit.
That seems to be a recurring theme. Famously, his father Henry II discovered John's name on a list of nobles plotting against him right before Henry died. A devastating blow.
And his relationship with Richard.
Complicated. Richard was actually quite generous to him, giving him lands despite John having plotted against Richard's regent while Richard was away on the Third Crusade. John even apparently tried to make a deal with the French King Philip II against Richard.
But Richard forgave him.
Remarkably, yes. After Richard was captured and held for ransom, John tried to seize control in England, but failed because the barons stayed loyal to Richard. Yet Richard reconciled with him and, surprisingly, named John his successor on his deathbed.
Even though there was another potential claimant.
Yes, Arthur of Brittany, his nephew, the son of an older deceased brother Geoffrey. That succession was contested. And John didn't help matters by quickly annulling his first marriage and marrying Isabella of Angoulême, which stirred up more trouble.
The sources highlight some real cruelty, too.
They really do. The incident in Mirabeau, where he captured Arthur. The strong suspicion, almost certainty, is that John had Arthur murdered shortly after.
Yeah.
While killing dynastic rivals wasn't unheard of, the stories surrounding Arthur's death are particularly grim.
And there are other examples.
Definitely. Verifiable ones. Like ordering prisoners from Mirabeau to be sent to Corfe Castle and basically starved to death. There's a chilling letter about that.
Yeah.
And the most notorious story is the fate of William de Brosse's wife, Maud, and their son. John imprisoned them, and they starved to death. There are gruesome, though unverified, details about Maud trying to eat her son's flesh.
Horrifying.
Absolutely. Add to that John's heavy taxes and his aggressive inquiries into who owed him feudal services, you can see why the barons were growing increasingly resentful.
And then his major conflict with the church.
Yes, a huge dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury led to England being placed under interdict and John himself being excommunicated in 1209. John actually used this, seizing church revenues for himself.
All this eventually led to the baronial revolt.
It did. There was a failed plot against him in 1211. He then tried a tactical move, making England a vassal state of the papacy, hoping to get the Pope on his side against the barons. But his military fortunes waned too. The decisive defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in France in 1214 against Philip II really weakened his position.
And that brings us to Magna Carta.
Exactly. After Bouvines, the barons saw their chance. They rallied, marched on London, and in 1215 at Runnymede, they forced John to agree to Magna Carta. The key takeaway is this wasn't John benevolently granting rights. It was forced upon him by armed rebellion, fueled by his tyranny and failures.
What were the key points of Magna Carta?
It addressed specific grievances the barons had, but crucially, it established principles like trial by peers, justice not being sold or delayed, and that the king himself was subject to the law. It even included a clause allowing the barons to take action against a king who broke the agreement, essentially, a right to rebellion against tyranny.
But John didn't stick to it.
Not for a minute. As soon as the barons dispersed, he repudiated it with the Pope's backing. This led to civil war. John died fairly soon after, in 1216, apparently of dysentery contracted while campaigning.
And his young son inherited the throne.
Yes, Henry III. He was only 9. His survival and the eventual reissuing of Magna Carta were largely thanks to loyal, capable barons like William Marshall.
And the bad King John legend lived on.
Oh, yes. Cemented by later writers like Matthew Paris, and then famously in popular culture by Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. The monk chroniclers especially painted him in the darkest colors, adding accusations, some likely true, some probably exaggerated or false, about his impiety, his cruelty, his alleged affairs with barons' wives, even false stories about how people died in his custody.
It's fascinating, though, how the reaction against such a deeply flawed king led directly to this foundational document, Magna Carta, that shaped law for centuries.
Absolutely. A landmark in constitutional history born directly out of resistance to perceived tyranny.
Okay, shifting focus again. From one king's troubles, let's look at the soldiers who served another empire, the Ottomans. Specifically, their elite troops.
The Janissaries.
Yeah.
Janissaries, meaning new soldiers. They were the Sultan's elite infantry, famous for their discipline, their loyalty, at least initially, and their effectiveness in battle.
And they had a very unique recruitment system, didn't they?
Yes, the Diffsirme, which literally means gathering or collecting. This started in the 1400s. Essentially, young Christian boys were conscripted from conquered territories, mainly in the Balkans, but also Anatolia and Armenia.
Why recruit Christian boys?
There were a couple of key reasons. Firstly, Islamic law generally forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, it prevented powerful Turkish noble families from dominating the military and potentially challenging the Sultan. These boys owed their loyalty solely to the Sultan.
What happened to the boys?
They were taken to Istanbul, converted to Islam, and given rigorous training. The brightest might go to palace schools for administrative roles, but the vast majority were trained for the army, with a heavy emphasis on obedience and military skills. Most ended up in the Janissary Corps.
And they became a formidable force.
Hugely formidable. Founded in the late 1300s, originally as a kind of bodyguard, they evolved into the empire's standing army. They were experts in archery, siege warfare, sapping, or undermining walls, and they were among the first infantry forces to effectively use firearms from the 1440s onwards.
They played a big role in Ottoman expansion.
Absolutely decisive. Their role in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 under Mehmed II was crucial. Their numbers grew significantly over time.
Were they just soldiers?
Primarily, but they also had other roles. They helped maintain public order in cities like Istanbul, especially during things like food riots. They were a visible presence receiving food subsidies, frequenting coffee houses and barbershops, often associated with the Bektashi Sufi order, which many Janissaries followed.
The sources mention some interesting symbols connected to them.
Yes, very important symbols. The kazan, their large soup kettle, was almost sacred. It represented their communal life and the Sultan's provision. Overturning the kazan became their traditional signal for revolt.
And their hats.
The burk, a distinctive white felt cap with a flap hanging down the back. It often had a slot to hold a spoon, again symbolizing camaraderie and dependence on the Sultan for food. Later, these became much more elaborate turbans.
But this powerful force eventually became a problem.
This is the crucial turn in their story. Over time, they went from being the Sultan's loyal tool to a powerful, entrenched interest group. They started interfering in politics, deposing viziers, even overthrowing sultans who displeased them.
So they became kingmakers or sultan breakers.
Exactly. New sultans often had to pay them a hefty bonus upon accession just to secure their initial loyalty. Attempts to reform or discipline them often ended badly. Sultan Osman II tried to curb their power in the 1620s, even planning to replace them, and found out and strangled them.
How did the ordinary people view them by then?
Increasingly negatively. In Istanbul, they gained a reputation for being bullies, thugs who acted with impunity, prone to rioting and extortion. A British naval officer visiting in the early 19th century wrote about their uncontrolled insolence and gross behavior.
So their decline mirrored the empire's decline.
They were certainly a factor. Their resistance to modernization and military reform and their constant meddling in politics contributed to the Ottoman Empire's slow decline in the 18th and 19th centuries. The state couldn't control its own elite troops.
How did it end for them?
Violently. After earlier failed attempts at reform, Sultan Mahmud II planned carefully. In 1826, when the Janissaries inevitably revolted against his new modern army corps overturning their sacred cauldrons, he was ready. Artillery bombarded their barracks, thousands were massacred. It became known as the Auspicious Incident.
A brutal end.
Extremely. While it was probably too late to reverse the empire's long-term decline, destroying the Janissaries did pave the way for military reforms that eventually produced figures like Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey.
And their music left a mark, too.
Yes. Their military bands, the meter bands with loud drums, cymbals, oboes, and trumpets, were famous for intimidating enemies and boosting morale. This Turkish music actually became fashionable in Europe and influenced composers like Mozart and Beethoven.
It's quite a story. A force created for loyalty becoming so powerful it threatened the state itself.
A classic example of how institutions can evolve in unexpected and sometimes dangerous ways.
Okay, let's shift back much further in time now to the fall of another, even bigger empire, Rome. And the sources here suggest new ways of thinking about why it fell.
Yes, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The traditional date is AD 476, when the last emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. For centuries, the debate about why it fell focused mainly on internal factors.
Things like corruption, political instability, the cost of the army, civil wars.
Exactly. Economic issues, too, like reliance on enslaved labor, high taxes, maybe technological stagnation. The famous historian Edward Gibbon argued it was sort of inevitable, immoderate greatness leading to decay.
But the sources you shared point to a newer perspective, adding other major factors.
This is a really key insight from recent scholarship, synthesized very powerfully by historian Kyle Harper. The argument is that we can't fully understand Rome's fall without considering the massive impact of climate change and epidemic diseases.
climate change in Roman times.
Absolutely. Harper argues that Rome's rise and initial flourishing coincided with a period of unusually stable and favorable climate in the Mediterranean, the Roman climate optimum, roughly from the 1st century BC to the mid-3rd century AD. This supported agriculture, population growth, the whole imperial system.
We have evidence for this.
Yes, things like Roman writers describing agricultural conditions, like Columella talking about rainfall patterns in Italy, and geological evidence, like studying ancient lake sediments or tree rings, plus evidence showing North Africa was much more fertile then than it is now.
But then the climate shifted.
Right. From around the mid-3rd century AD, evidence suggests a trend towards cooling and, crucially, greater climate instability and aridity in the Mediterranean region. This was linked to subtle changes in solar radiation. This shift would have strained agriculture, contributing to the crisis of the 3rd century. There are contemporary accounts, like Bishop Cyprian of Carthage writing about the world seeming grown old with less fertile seasons.
And on top of this came devastating plagues.
Yes, this is the other huge factor Harper emphasizes. Rome's very success, its large cities, its interconnected trade routes, ironically made it incredibly vulnerable to the spread of infectious diseases.
Like the Antonine Plague.
That was the first big one, hitting from about 165 to 180 AD. It caused massive mortality, maybe killing up to 10% of the population. Thanks to recent advances in paleopathology, studying ancient diseases, we now think it was almost certainly smallpox.
Smallpox? Wow, where did it come from?
The thinking is it was likely a zoonotic disease, one that jumped from animals to humans, possibly originating from rodents like gerbils, perhaps in Africa or the East, related to viruses like camelpox. It hit Rome hard, reportedly killing thousands a day at its peak, even changing burial customs.
And there was another major plague later.
Yes, the plague of Cyprian, which struck during that troubled mid-3rd century from around 251 to 270 AD. This one seems to have been even more devastating. Ancient sources describe horrific symptoms. Harper suggests, based on the descriptions, it might have been a viral hemorrhagic fever, maybe something like Ebola or Marburg virus, possibly originating from bats or rodents.
So climate instability and these massive plagues seriously weakened the empire.
Profoundly weakened it, straining its resources, manpower, economy, and social fabric, right when it was also facing political and military crises.
But the empire didn't completely collapse then. It recovered somewhat in the 4th century.
It did, surprisingly. Under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, the empire reorganized and regained some stability. Interestingly, some research suggests this period might have coincided with temporarily slightly more favorable, though still variable, climate conditions in some areas, perhaps linked to a pattern called the North Atlantic Oscillation. But even then, sources mention severe famines, like one in Cappadocia.
How does climate link to the barbarian migrations?
This is another crucial connection. The argument is that climate change outside the Roman borders played a major role. Significant droughts on the vast Eurasian steppe likely destabilized nomadic pastoral groups like the Huns.
So the Huns were maybe climate refugees.
That's the idea. Facing ecological crisis, they moved westward, putting pressure on other groups like the Goths, who lived closer to the Roman frontier. This pressure contributed to the Visigoths seeking refuge inside the Roman Empire in 378. When they were mistreated, they revolted, leading to the disastrous Battle of Adrianople where Emperor Valens was killed.
So environmental pressures outside fueled the pressures on Rome's borders.
Exactly. It connects the environmental story directly to the traditional narrative of invasions. After Adrianople, the Western Empire faced relentless pressure. The crucial loss was the Vandal conquest of North Africa in 429, which cut off Rome's main grain supply. Then came Attila the Hun's campaigns, the sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455, leading eventually to 476.
What's so compelling about this is how it integrates environmental and biological factors into the story. It wasn't just politics and armies, it was also climate shifts and microbes.
It paints a much more complex, interconnected picture, emphasizing that human history unfolds within and is profoundly shaped by the natural world.
Okay, we've covered empires rising and falling, laws, soldiers. Let's zoom in now on a few specific, remarkable innovations and discoveries highlighted in the sources.
Good idea. And let's start with someone whose invention had a truly profound impact, Louis Braille.
It's hard to imagine civilization without writing and reading, and Braille's story is incredible, becoming blind as a child and then as a teenager, inventing the system of raised dots that opened up literacy for blind people everywhere. Helen Keller compared him to Gutenberg.
His life was changed by a tragic accident. Born in 1809 in a small French village, his father was a saddler. At age 3, Louis was playing in his father's workshop, accidentally injured one eye with an awl. The wound got infected, the infection spread to the other eye, and by age 5 he was completely blind. This was long before antibiotics, of course.
But his parents supported him.
They did. They didn't want him treated as less than human, which was often the attitude then. They managed to get him to the local school, and then at age 10, secured him a place at the Royal Institute for Blind Youth in Paris, the first school of its kind in the world.
What was this school like?
Conditions were apparently pretty grim, housed in a damp former prison. But Braille thrived academically and made friends. The source notes it was probably here he contracted tuberculosis, the disease that eventually killed him, but it was also where he found his calling.
And the inspiration for his system came from a military code.
Kind of indirectly, yes. A Captain Charles Barbier visited the school to demonstrate his night writing system. It used raised dots and dashes, intended for soldiers to read messages silently in the dark. It was based on phonetics, though, and apparently quite clumsy.
But Braille saw the potential.
He did. He realized the principle of using dots could work, but it needed to be simpler, based on the alphabet, not sounds. His breakthrough was the 6-dot cell, 2 columns of 3 dots. The different combinations could represent letters, numbers, punctuation, elegantly and efficiently.
And he developed this when he was just 15.
Astonishingly young, yes, between 1824 and 1825. The students at the Institute quickly saw how good it was and started using it among themselves unofficially. Braille himself acknowledged Barbier's idea as the starting point in his first published description in 1829.
But getting it officially adopted was a struggle.
A huge struggle. He became a teacher at the Institute himself, but faced resistance from the sighted authorities. They often preferred raised versions of standard letters, which sighted people could also read, even though they were much harder for blind people to decipher tactilely. At one point, a new director actually banned Braille, burned the Braille books, and punished students caught using it.
That's terrible, but Braille kept fighting.
He did, apparently, quite patiently and gracefully. He continued teaching, refining his system, even developing a related system for writing called roughigraphy or decapoint, using raised dots to form standard letter shapes. And importantly, he created a brilliant system for tactile music notation. He was a talented organist and cellist himself.
When did the breakthrough come?
Real recognition began around 1844, during the inauguration of the Institute's new building. Apparently, students gave a compelling demonstration of reading and writing using Braille, finally convincing the director, or perhaps his assistant persuaded him, of its superiority.
Did he live to see it widely adopted?
Sadly, no. Louis Braille died relatively young, age 43, in 1852, from tuberculosis. His death initially went almost unnoticed. Universal adoption took decades longer, and International Congress agreed on it in 1878, but standardization across languages like English took until the 1930s and later, unified globally by UNESCO after World War II.
What's his legacy today?
Immense. Millions use Braille worldwide. Technology helps now with digital Braille displays and conversion software. Though, interestingly, the source notes concerns about declining Braille literacy because of audio screen readers.
But it highlights cognitive benefits, too.
Yes, this is fascinating. Experts argue that the act of reading and writing Braille engages the brain, particularly literacy centers, in ways that passive listening doesn't. Brain scans even show the visual cortex lighting up in blind Braille readers. So there's a push to keep Braille literacy strong, seeing it not just as a code, but as fundamental to deep literacy and thinking. As one curator put it, defending Braille is defending intelligence itself. Braille saw disability not as a lack, but as a strength, a different way of perceiving.
His story is just incredible, overcoming personal tragedy, the sheer brilliance of the invention at such a young age, and the perseverance against resistance to give the gift of literacy.
A truly transformative figure.
Okay, from the power of touch in reading, let's turn to the power of art, specifically in ancient Egypt, guiding a soul through the afterlife.
Right, we're looking at the tomb of Queen Nefertari. She was the great royal wife of Ramses II, the famous pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, probably his favorite wife, very influential.
Ramses the Great. And he built her an exceptional tomb.
One of the most beautiful tombs ever discovered in Egypt, located in the Valley of the Queens, near Thebes. Its ancient name was Taset Neferu, the place of the beauties.
What makes it so special?
Although it was looted in antiquity, like most tombs, the thieves left behind the real treasure, the wall paintings. Over 5,000 square feet of stunningly preserved, vibrant paintings covering almost every surface. When Ernesto Schiaparelli rediscovered it in 1904, He was just blown away by its beauty.
And the paintings tell a story.
Absolutely. They aren't just decorative. The tomb itself was designed as a kind of microcosm of the Egyptian cosmos. Ceilings are the sky, the floor is the earth. The burial chamber represented the realm of Osiris, god of the underworld. The paintings depict Nefertari's journey through the underworld, following instructions from the Book of the Dead, aiming for rebirth with the sun god Re.
So the art is like a map or guide for her soul.
Exactly. A visual instruction manual. It shows the challenges she faces, the gods she needs to appease, the spells she needs to know. For example, depictions of gateways are accompanied by the names of the demonic guardians she must name correctly to pass.
Can you give some examples of the journey shown in the art?
Sure. As you descend the entrance stairs, goddesses and the jackal-headed Anubis stand guard. In the main burial chamber, the ceiling is painted like a starry night sky. Pillars show Nefertari interacting with key deities like Osiris and Isis. Walls depict her navigating the underworld, making offerings like wine, symbolizing rejuvenation. The goddess Mot, representing truth and cosmic order, protects her name, her cartouche.
And there are different chambers representing different stages.
Yes. Side chambers might have held grave goods, like Ushabti figurines meant to work for her in the afterlife. A key chamber, the vestibule, marks the transition from the nocturnal journey to the daytime emergence. Here she meets Khepri, the scarab god symbolizing rebirth, and other solar deities.
I read she's even shown playing a game.
Yes. In one of the upper chambers, representing critical stages of rebirth, there's a famous scene of her playing Senet. It was a popular board game, but it also had deep symbolic meaning connected to passing through the afterlife. She's shown playing it against an unseen opponent, perhaps fate itself, sitting in a booth with her bot, her soul, depicted as a human-headed bird perched nearby.
What happens in the final stages?
In the antechamber, she's shown ready to go forth by day, reborn. There are images of her mummified body being resurrected by Isis and Nephthys, and her worshipping the Bennu bird, another symbol of solar rebirth. The whole sequence culminates in her successfully emerging from the tomb, reborn like the sun god Re each morning.
The level of detail and symbolism is just astounding.
It really is. Nefertari's tomb is perhaps the most spectacular example we have of how ancient Egyptian art served a profound, functional spiritual purpose to ensure the deceased's safe passage and eternal life through intricate visual narratives.
Amazing. Okay, for our final stop on this deep dive, let's travel east to an ancient city in modern-day Pakistan that was a real crossroads of cultures.
We're talking about Taxila, an incredibly ancient site, possibly founded 3,000 years ago, and hugely significant because of its position on the Silk Roads. It became this major melting pot of cultures and religions.
It had a really long and varied history, right?
Extremely varied. It's mentioned in Indian epics like the Ramayana. It was important in the Vedic period, became a major Buddhist center in the Gandhara region. Then it was conquered by the Persians, influenced by the Greeks after Alexander the Great passed through. Rebuilt by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, later ruled by Indo-Greeks, Scythians, Parthians.
And then the Kushan Empire.
Yes, under the Kushans, roughly from the 1st to 4th centuries AD, Taxila really flourished as this syncretic center, where Hinduism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism all coexisted and interacted.
And its location was key to all this.
Absolutely critical. It sat right at the junction of 3 major trade routes connecting Western Asia, Kashmir, and central India. It was perfectly positioned to benefit from the booming trade between the Roman Empire and the East, especially from around 50 BC onwards. Its proximity to mountain passes made it a gateway between Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Tibetan Plateau.
How did it eventually decline?
Like many great ancient cities in that region, it met a violent end. It was sacked by invading Huns, likely the White Huns or Hephthalites, in the 5th century AD, and was largely abandoned after that.
Forgotten for centuries.
Pretty much, until British archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century during the Raj. Figures like Alexander Cunningham, the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, ASI, used classical Greek texts and the writings of the 7th century Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang to identify the site.
But the major excavations came later.
Yes, under Sir John Marshall, who took over the ASI in 1902. He began large-scale excavations at Taxila in 1913 using Cunningham's earlier notes. It was Marshall's work that really uncovered the extent and richness of the site.
What did he find?
He and his team uncovered successive layers of the city, revealing its long history. They found 3 distinct urban centers built over time. The oldest, Bir Mound, dating back perhaps to 500 BC. A second city, Sirkap, laid out on a Greek grid plan around 200 BC. And a third, Sursuk, from the Kushan period.
And lots of artifacts and monuments.
Huge amounts, including stunning examples of Gandharan art, the unique style blending Buddhist subjects with Hellenistic sculptural techniques. He found statues, reliefs, jewelry, coins, everyday objects. He also excavated major religious sites outside the city walls, like the massive Dharmarajika Stupa, originally built by Ashoka, and various Buddhist monasteries like Jolyon and Moramuradu, famous for their stucco sculptures. He was also instrumental in creating the Taxila Museum right there on site.
Was his work universally praised?
He was highly regarded, especially for supporting Indian archaeologists. However, later archaeologists, like Sir Mortimer Wheeler, criticized his excavation methods, particularly for not always carefully distinguishing between different stratigraphic layers, sometimes mixing artifacts from different periods. Later work has refined the chronology.
But the overall picture is one of incredible cultural fusion.
Unquestionably. Taxila was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980, precisely because its ruins offer such vivid evidence of the interaction between different cultures, Persian, Greek, Indian, Central Asian, through conquest and trade. The Gandharan art is the prime example. Buddhas and bodhisattvas depicted with features reminiscent of Greek gods wearing toga-like robes. You see Greek architectural elements like Corinthian columns in Buddhist monasteries. It's a unique blend.
What's so fascinating about Taxila is seeing that tangible evidence of globalization, ancient style, how trade and empires brought different worlds together in one place.
Exactly. It's a physical reminder of how interconnected the ancient world really was, long before we think of globalization today.
Wow. What an incredible journey through these sources. We've covered so much ground.
We really have. From the nitty-gritty of daily life, marriage, and law in ancient Babylon,
to figuring out who the Phoenicians actually were, more city-states mastering the sea than one unified people.
and jumping forward to trace the origins of pharmacies back to monastery gardens and the slow rise of regulation.
And wrestling with the notorious legacy of bad King John and how resistance to him gave us Magna Carta.
Understanding the rise and fall of the Janissaries, the Ottoman elite troops who turned from loyal servants to a destabilizing force.
Revisiting the fall of Rome through a new lens, adding climate change and devastating plagues to the story.
Celebrating the genius and perseverance of Louis Braille, who unlocked literacy for millions.
Deciphering the stunning artwork in Queen Nefertari's tomb as a literal guide to the afterlife.
And exploring Taxila, that amazing ancient crossroads where Greek, Indian, and other cultures met and mingled.
So this has been your deep dive. We've pulled out some of the key insights, the surprising details, the important takeaways from all that material you provided, hopefully giving you that informed edge.
And maybe something to leave you thinking about. Running through all these different stories from vastly different times and places is this thread of human struggle and ingenuity. People trying to impose order with laws, seeking health through remedies, striving for immortality through belief in art, finding ways to communicate across barriers, defining who they are, all while facing forces sometimes beyond their control, like climate or disease. How do those ancient efforts, those successes and failures revealed in these sources, echo the challenges and choices we still face today?